Being a jack of all trades sounds like a good thing, doesn't it? It seems as if having a wide range of knowledge and skills, as well as the ability to perform many kinds of tasks, would lead to a more productive life. Yet, it is not necessarily so. It might be true that if you lived alone on a desert island, but for the rest of us, being able to do everything for ourselves might not be an advantage. To illustrate this fact, economists Robert H. Frank, professor of economics, and Ben Bernanke, chairman of the Federal Reserve from 2006 to 2014, gave an example of Berkman Ray, a man from a poor rural village in the country of Bhutan. In the 1960s, Berkman worked as a cook for Frank in Nepal, where Frank was a Peace Corps volunteer. Not only was Berkman an excellent cook, but he could also do many other things. He could butcher a goat, make furniture, thatch a roof, and build a house. Moreover, he could sew clothing, repair appliances, craft objects from tin, and even prepare home remedies. In short, Berkman was a jack-of-all-trades who had a much wider range of skills and abilities than most Americans. Frank and Bernanke pointed out that although Berkman was very talented, he was by no means unique in Nepal. In the recent past, many people in Nepal were able to perform a variety of tasks that we, as Americans, would hire others to do. What accounted for this difference? It might seem that people in Nepal did more things for themselves because they lived in a poor country where many people could not afford to pay others for their services. But then Frank and Bernanke offered another explanation. They argued that poverty was the result, and not the cause of the jack-of-all-trades phenomenon in Nepal. The Nepalis do not perform their own services because they are poor, Frank and Bernard wrote. Rather, they are poor largely because they perform their own services. Frank and Bernanke argued that instead of doing almost everything themselves, poor Nepalis would be better off specializing in the production of particular goods and services. The specialization is a hallmark of industrialization. It gained importance as a result of the division of labor during the Industrial Revolution and served to increase industrial production and thus trade. Specialization's role in industry often means that it is absent from non-industrial societies. According to Frank and Bernanke, if the Nepalese adopted specialization, they could trade among themselves to obtain any goods and services they do not produce. The result, as the trade makes people better off principle tells us, would be more wealth and a better standard of living. It may be nice to know how to do many things, but that does not mean it is in your economic interest to do them. In this lesson, you will examine how specialization in trade can make people better off than they would otherwise be. If you had lived 200 years ago, there is a good chance you and your family would have been much more self-sufficient, like the people in Nepal in the 1960s. You might have grown your own food, built your own house, made your own tools, and performed many other tasks for yourself rather than depending on others. Although self-sufficiency may be an appealing idea, it is not necessarily economically productive. In fact, societies that emphasize self-sufficiency are less productive and have a lower standard of living than those that rely on specialization and trade. Why is this the case? In The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith wrote about the advantages of specialization, an approach to production in which individual workers become highly skilled at a specific task. Smith illustrated this principle by describing a pen factory. One man draws out the wire, another straightens it, a third cuts it, a fourth points it, a fifth grinds it, and at the top for receiving the head. To make the head requires 2 or 3 distinct operations. I have seen a small manufactory of this kind, where 10 men only were employed, who could, when they exerted themselves, make among them upwards the 48,000 pens in a day. But if they had all worked separately and independently, without any of them having been educated to this particular business, which after all was peculiar, they certainly could not each of them have made 20, perhaps not 1 pen in a day. Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, 1776. Smith's description illustrates the division of labor that arises from specialization. It also underscores the great efficiency and productivity that results when workers divide the individual tasks that make up a job and become expert at those specific tasks. Smith's pen workers were far more productive when each worker specialized in one step of the manufacturing process. What was true for Smith's pen factory in the late 1700s is also true for an entire economy today. An economy can produce more with the same inputs of land, labor, and capital when each person or business specializes in a skill or task. As productivity increases, more products and services become available to more people, and living standards rise for society as a whole. If specialization is so great, shouldn't all societies specialize? The answer, said Smith, has to do with population density and isolation from large markets. He observed, for example, that specialization in the late 1700s was more developed in large British cities than in less populated rural areas such as the Scottish Highlands. In the lone houses and very small villages which are scattered about in so deserted a country, as the Highlands of Scotland, every farmer must be butcher, baker, and brewer for his own family. A country carpenter is not only a carpenter, but a joiner, a cabinet maker, and even a carver in wood, as well as a wheelwright, a plugwright, a cart and wagon maker. In big cities, however, where the market for each of these jobs was large, different specialists would have performed these tasks. These workers could specialize because they knew that there were enough customers to sustain them. But markets in rural Scotland were too small and the region too isolated to support a range of specialists. Therefore, people had to perform a variety of tasks to earn a living and to satisfy their wants. In the 1960s, a similar scenario existed in Nepal, one of the most remote and isolated countries in the world. Nepal actually had a higher population density than many countries in the world, including the United States. However, the country's rugged mountainous terrain and relatively underdeveloped transportation system, limited contact among different regions and with neighboring nations. These factors made trade difficult and helped keep Nepal's market small, thus discouraging specialization. Today, these factors still affect the country, but to a lesser extent. The United States presents a very different picture. Beginning in the second half of the 20th century, much of the country is increasingly becoming linked to other regions and the rest of the world through an advanced system of transformation and communications. The system has promoted trade and the growth of markets and encouraged the development of a highly specialized economy. The specialization has been evident in a variety of jobs performed by American workers. The U.S. Department of Labor's Occupational Outlook Handbook, for example, published in 1948 to begin with, lists thousands of types of jobs. These jobs range from familiar occupations like carpenter, engineer, and teacher to more specific jobs like a budget analyst, recreational therapist, and violin repairer. The people who work in these jobs are specialists, each pursuing a particular career. When people specialize, they no longer produce everything for themselves. As a result, they must trade with others to obtain those things they do not produce. They trade not only to satisfy their own wants, but also to focus on what they do best. An economist and author, Charles Whelan, once pointed out, we trade with others because it frees up time and resources to do things that we are better at. Whelan noted that we could, in theory, do many more things for ourselves. We could raise our own livestock, for example, and not have to pay others for meat, milk, and cheese. But that would require an enormous amount of time and energy, and the opportunity cost, as measured by all the other things we could be doing, would be very high. Besides, what do most of us know about meat and dairy production? In the end, we are better off when we specialize in activities suited to our skills and trade for everything else. Trade is a voluntary exchange in which both parties give up something in order to get something else they want. People trade because it is in their mutual interests. As economists James Gwandney, Richard Stroop, and Dwight Lee pointed out in their book Common Sense Economics, the foundation of trade is mutual gain. People agree to an exchange because they expect it to improve their well-being. In traditional economies, trade often takes the form of barter, the direct exchange of one good or service for another. For example, a farmer and a shepherd might agree to barter by exchanging a basket of potatoes for a bag of wool. Barter works well when there is a coincidence of wants. That is, when two people have something that they want to exchange with one another. In market economies, money is used instead for bartering. Money is a medium of exchange that can be traded for goods or services or used to pay off debts or debits. Money is useful only when its value is generally accepted throughout society. It facilitates trade because it is easy to carry and convenient to use for commercial transactions. Whether carried out through barter or with money, trade leads to economic interdependence. When we specialize in trade, we depend on other people or countries to produce many of the goods and services we want. A modern economy consists of a complex web of economic links that connect producers and consumers throughout society and across borders. This economic interdependence is apparent in the foods that an American may eat for breakfast. For example, breakfast might begin with a glass of juice made from Florida oranges. It could then be followed by toast made from Kansas wheat, eggs from Iowa, or hash browns made from Idaho potatoes. We might also enjoy a cup of coffee made from Colombian coffee beans. In other words, our breakfast depends on food produced by people in many different places, both domestic and international. Like Adam Smith, our country's founders believed that trade and economic interdependence are essential to a nation's economic growth. In the years just after independence, the new country experienced problems with states erecting trade barriers against each other. These trade barriers, which included tariffs and other measures to limit interstate trade, were designed to protect local industry and promote self-sufficiency. However, they prompted conflicts between states and made it difficult for the country to develop a unified national economy. The framers of the Constitution encouraged the growth of a national market by giving Congress alone the power to regulate interstate commerce. Article 1, Section 8, also known as the Commerce Clause, states, Congress shall have power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states. This clause empowers the national government to promote trade and economic interdependence among the states. To that end, the federal government maintains an interstate highway system and regulates navigation on interstate rivers and lakes. These government actions help build and continue to support a large and prosperous national economy. In a Robinson Crusoe economy, which we learned about in Lesson 2, the economy is made up of a single person who is both the producer and the consumer of whatever goods he or she is able to produce. In the case of Crusoe, who was stranded on a desert island, his lack of contact with the outside world means that he had no chance to improve his standard of living through trade. Suppose, however, that a second castaway, a young man named Jim Hawkins, were to wash up on the island one day. Now, Crusoe would have someone to talk to, as well as a potential trading partner. But would trade make life better for either Crusoe or Hawkins? To find out, consider the following scenario. Shortly after Hawkins' arrival, Crusoe tells him about the island's two main economic activities, collecting coconuts and fishing. Right away, the castaways face a critical question. Would they be better off working separately and fending for themselves, or joining forces and working together? As it turns out, Hawkins is a more efficient worker than Crusoe. He is younger, stronger, and better at almost everything, including collecting coconuts and fishing. As a result, he enjoys an absolute advantage in food production. Figure 4.2a shows how many coconuts and fish each castaway is able to collect in a given amount of time. Crusoe can harvest 10 coconuts or catch 10 fish in 1 hour for a total of 40 coconuts or 40 fish in a 4-hour workday. Hawkins can harvest 30 coconuts and catch 15 fish in an hour. In 4 hours, he can pick 120 coconuts or catch 60 fish. At first, the two men decide to work together and equally share the food they produce. Hawkins soon begins to wonder, however, whether he might be better off moving to the other side of the island and working for himself, based off on his absolute advantage as a food producer. He concludes that it is in his interest to go it alone. At the time, 3 centuries ago, most people would have agreed with Jim Hawkins' decision. A century later, however, new economic insights might have led Jim Hawkins to a different conclusion. Those insights came from the pioneering work of the English economist David Ricardo, who in the year 1817 developed the theory of comparative advantage. Comparative advantage is defined as the ability to perform a task at a lower opportunity cost than somebody else. Opportunity cost, you will remember, is the value of what you give up to do something. As a producer, you have an absolute advantage if the time and labor required for you to produce something is less than it is for another producer. But you have a comparative advantage if your opportunity cost is less than another producer's opportunity cost. Ricardo's breakthrough was to see that regardless of absolute advantage, people could benefit from specializing in these activities in which they had a comparative advantage. Ricardo developed this principle in response to new English import tariffs known as Corn Laws. These tariffs place a tax on imported grain in order to raise its price and protect English grain growers who could not compete with cheaper foreign grain. This tariff helped farmers and wealthy landowners, but it did hurt factory workers who could not grow their own food and had to pay more for their bread. Ricardo argued that although cheap grain to enter England would force the English to cut back on grain production and to instead concentrate their resources on manufacturing, which was increasingly where their advantage lay. In other words, English producers should specialize in goods in which they had a comparative advantage and then trade with foreign producers. The results, Ricardo said, would benefit society as a whole. The Production Possibilities Frontier, PPFs, in Figure 4.2b, shows how Ricardo's theory can be applied to Crusoe and Hawkins. Remember that a PPF shows how much of two products or services a person or an economy can produce in a given quantity of time. Crusoe's PPF shows that he can produce 40 coconuts or 40 fish in 4 hours. If he divides this time between the two activities, he can produce a combination of coconuts and fish in varying amounts. For example, point A on the graph indicates that Crusoe can collect 20 coconuts and 20 fish in a typical 4-hour day. According to Jim Hawkins' PPF, in addition to his daily rate of 120 coconuts or 60 fish, he can produce mixed quantities such as 90 coconuts and 1.5 fish. This mixed quantity is represented by point B. The PPFs clearly show Hawkins' absolute advantage in food production. But do they indicate any comparative advantage for either Crusoe or Hawkins? To answer this question, we must first calculate the opportunity cost associated with each activity. Crusoe's data shows that for every 10 coconuts he harvests, he gives up the opportunity to catch 10 fish. So, his opportunity cost for each coconut is 1 fish, and his opportunity cost for each fish is 1 coconut. Hawkins has different opportunity costs. For every 30 coconuts he picks, he gives up the opportunity to catch 15 fish. Therefore, Hawkins' opportunity cost for each coconut is 1.5, or 1/2 a fish, but his opportunity cost for each fish is 2 coconuts. Both men's opportunity costs are shown in Figure 4.2. As Figure 4.2 shows, Hawkins' opportunity cost for collecting coconuts is lower than Crusoe's, 1/2 fish for Hawkins versus 1 fish for Crusoe. This gives Hawkins a comparative advantage over Crusoe in harvesting coconuts. On the other hand, Crusoe's opportunity cost for fishing is lower, 1 coconut for Crusoe versus 2 coconuts for Hawkins. This means that Crusoe has a comparative advantage over Hawkins in fishing, even though he does not have an absolute advantage. According to Ricardo's theory, Crusoe and Hawkins should each specialize in the activity in which he has a comparative advantage. Therefore, Crusoe should fish and Hawkins should harvest coconuts. They could then trade with each other to obtain the product they do not produce. But would this deal work to their benefit? Figure 4.2 shows that each castaway might gain from trading based on comparative advantage. The first 2 columns provide production and consumption values for both men without specialization and trade. These columns contain the values represented by points A and B in Figure 4.2. The next 2 columns show how production and consumption values, if the castaways were to agree to specialize and then trade 17 fish for 25 coconuts. The production value shows how much each man could produce by specializing. The consumption values indicate how much of both products the men could have if they then traded with each other. The last column shows that what each man could gain from this particular trade. Crusoe would have 25 coconuts he got from Hawkins, along with 23 fish he did not trade. His decision to trade would result in a gain of 5 coconuts and 3 fish. As for Hawkins, after trading 25 coconuts to Crusoe, he would still have 95 left, 5 more than he would have had if he had chosen to go it alone. He would also have the 17 fish he got from Crusoe, 2 more than he would have had without trade. So both castaways would gain from specialization and trade. The PBS in Figure 4.2e shows the original production possibilities for the castaways, along with the increased amount they would receive through trade. The new amounts, represented by point A and point B, sit outside the PPF curve, indicating the gains the castaways would have made from trade. What is true for individuals is also true for nations, including the United States. When the principle of comparative advantages is allowed to guide who produces what, for example, Florida's farmers grow oranges and Idaho farmers grow potatoes, society usually benefits. Some of the factors that give rise to comparative advantage, such as climate and natural resources, may be fairly obvious. The main reason Florida has an advantage over Idaho in orange production is that oranges grow better in warm climates. Likewise, Nevada has a comparative advantage in gold production because of its gold deposits. Saudi Arabia excels in oil production because of its abundant oil reserves, while Canada can produce timber from its vast forests. When it comes to farming, mining, forestry, and fishing, geography determines where comparative advantage lies. Other factors, including education, wage levels, and technology differences, also play a role in determining comparative advantage. Most developed nations, such as the United States and Japan, with their many colleges and universities, have a highly skilled, high-wage workforce. This gives these countries a comparative advantage in the development of advanced technologies, such as computer systems. Less developed nations, on the other hand, tend to have less skilled, lower-wage workforces. Such countries often have a comparative advantage in the production of assembly line goods like clothing that do not require highly skilled labor. The beauty of comparative advantage, as economists see it, is that it stands to benefit all trading partners. Countries with abundant resources, such as plentiful natural resources and high human capital, can actually gain more by specializing in what they do best in trading with other countries. However, even countries with no absolute advantages can benefit. They need to find out what they can produce at a lower opportunity cost than other countries. Their comparative advantage and trade. The principle that trade makes people better off is fundamental to the economic way of thinking. Another way to state this principle is that trade raises our standard of living and makes us wealthier. To appreciate this, try imagining life without the volume of trade we enjoy today. What would it be like? You might wake up in the morning to a cold house that your family built for itself because there would be no gas or electricity, which is only available through trade. You would build a fire from wood you helped to gather and chop. For breakfast, you would eat food that your family produced, perhaps in a backyard garden. Of course, you would have no appliances to cook with, no toaster or microwave, because these things also depend on trade. You would put on clothes made at home, perhaps using wool from sheep you raised. Then, unless your family owned a horse, cars and bikes are out of the question. You would probably walk to school. This imaginary scenario gives you an idea of how much harder life would be without trade. The fact is that trade does make us wealthier and makes people better off because of this. Trade does this in three main ways. It puts goods in the hands of those who value them. It increases the quantity and variety of goods. It lowers the costs of goods. Trade can increase the value of goods even when nothing new is produced. Think about a second-hand item you might buy offline or online or at a flea market or garage sale. The fact that this item is for sale and that you are willing to buy it means that it is more value to you and than to the person who is selling it. Otherwise, there would be no exchange. Trades of this kind move goods from people who value them less to people who value them more. Even though the product has merely changed hands, its value has increased. Here is a simple example of how a voluntary exchange increases the value of goods. Imagine that you own a basketball cap that is practically new but does not fit you. A friend of yours owns a soccer ball that she no longer wants. She wants your hat and you want her soccer ball, so you trade. Why? Because you expect to be happier or better off afterward. Each good has more value for its new owner than for its previous owner. When we trade for things we value, our wealth increases. Most people define wealth as money and the things money can buy, but economists define wealth more broadly. Economist Michael Bade defines wealth as the total value of all the things a person owns. Notice that he did not say the total monetary value. This implies that wealth, which is often measured in dollars and cents and coins, can also be measured in other ways. As economist Paul Hayne pointed out, wealth, in the economic way of thinking, is whatever people value, which is another way of saying that trading for a used soccer ball can make you wealthier if a soccer ball is what you really want. At the start of this lesson, you read about Burkaman, the jack of all trades who was skilled at many jobs. In Nepal, where he lived, modern consumer goods were once relatively scarce, especially in rural areas. In contrast, the United States and other highly developed nations have had access to consumer goods of all kinds since the 19th century, where many embrace specialization. Specialization has enabled these countries to produce more goods for their own use and for trade with other countries. This trade, in turn, has provided access to a range of goods from around the world. As a result, the quantity and variety of goods available in the developed world has been and continues to be enormous. Just think about the choices you have as a consumer. If you want to buy cheese, for example, you can go to a supermarket and choose from many different kinds. You can buy cheddar or Swiss, Brie or Colby, Monterey Jack, or Camembert. And these are only a few of the choices. The variety is mind-boggling. In Nepal, however, the selection tends to be more limited, particularly outside the main cities, as at a store in a small village, for example, there might be just one type of cheese. However, this will likely change as the Nepalese economy becomes more specialized. Ultimately, in a specialized economy with abundant trade, the variety and quantity of goods are far greater. As a result, the society is wealthier and more people are materially better off. In addition to making more goods available, trade lowers the cost of those goods. It can do this in two ways. First, trade lowers the cost of goods by opening markets to less costly goods from other places. Countries that have a comparative advantage in the production of certain goods may be able to provide those goods to another country's consumers at a lower cost than American producers can. Second, trade can lower the cost of goods by expanding markets for products. Larger markets, in turn, allow producers to take advantage of the savings that come with mass production or large-scale manufacturing. For example, a company that produces thousands of loaves of bread each day might be able to buy its flour at a much lower cost than could a small neighborhood bakery. It could then pass those savings along to consumers by lowering the price of its bread. Nations generally benefit by expanding trade across their borders. This is true for both rich and poor countries. As world trade has expanded, the availability of goods has increased, while costs have decreased. Trade also supports economic growth, efficiency, and greater innovation, as the authors of Common Sense Economics point out. The growth of international trade has made it possible for the world to produce a larger output and achieve a higher level of consumption than otherwise would have been the case. The poor in particular have benefited from the freer trade, and worldwide nearly 1 billion people moved out of extreme poverty in the 20 years from 1990 to 2010. James D. Courtney, Richard L. Stroop, Dwight R. Lee, Tawny H. Ferrani, Joseph B. Calhoun, Common Sense Economics, 2016. Not everyone gains from expanding global trade, however. Cheap imports from countries with a comparative advantage may take businesses away from the American producers and even force them out of business. When U.S. factories close, American workers lose their jobs. This is a reason why workers and communities affected by plant closings often expose free trade. Most economics agree, however, that expanding trade is good for Americans and the U.S. economy as a whole. Although some people are harmed by foreign competition, most Americans benefit. Economist Tim Harford notes, "It is simply not possible for trade to destroy all of our jobs and for us to import everything from abroad and export nothing. If we did, we would have nothing to buy the imports with, for there would be trade at all. Somebody in America must be making something to sell to the outside world." Tim Harford, The Undercover Economist, 2012. If trade makes people better off, what does this mean for you? It suggests that you too can use comparative advantage to improve your life prospects. To find your comparative advantage, you must first decide what you like to do and can do well. If you focus on your strengths and specialize in what you do well, you will be making use of your comparative advantage. To summarize, we live in a world in which people and nations are economically interdependent, a result of specialization in trade. The benefits of trade can be seen in increased wealth and a higher standard of living. When people specialize, the resulting division of labor increases productivity. However, those who specialize must trade to obtain what they do not make themselves. This trade gives rise to economic interdependence. The principle of comparative advantage is what enables producers to gain from specialization in trade. By producing goods or services that have the lowest opportunity cost and then trading them, people and nations end up being more efficient and productive. Trade makes societies wealthier by moving goods to people who value them the most. Trade also increases the quantity and variety of goods and lowers the cost of goods.